I've been told by a student that if art were a video game, it would be Dark Souls, because it's fucking impossible. But all it really takes is practice and persistence to succeed. And there is some truth to that, since Dark Souls is an action role-playing game and art is an RPG. Did you know that art's an RPG? But what's the skill tree look like? Now before we start, here's the usual disclaimer.
I'm going to be going about this as guiding someone who wants to be a professional artist, but please be clear, you do not need this to be your goal. You're free to use this information however you like for your own art journey.
Now, to know what's in the art fundamentals, we need to take a look at what goes into making a picture. This is going to be slightly less detailed, but it should give you a general idea of how everything connects. Because if I actually try to show you everything, it would end up looking something like this. So first, we're going to divide this into two parts: drawing and color. Drawing is the technical side of making the picture, and it's akin to the crafting skill that you have in an RPG game. So the higher you level your crafting skill, the cooler items you can make. So this makes up about 70% of a drawing. Now color is what enhances the drawing. It takes up about 30%. This is because color merely enhances what's already there. So think of color like enchantment magic and you're trying to make magic items. So this works by doubling the item stats. This includes negative stats. So if it had a stat of 8, it would turn that to a 16. But if it had a negative 5, then it turns that to a negative 10. This is why it's easier for you to notice mistakes after you color a picture. That's why it's important for you to focus on crafting good items first. And by that, I mean having a good drawing as a base. Just because you paint a car wreck Ferrari red does not make it a Ferrari. Now, under drawing, we start off with the drawing fundamentals. So this includes line, shape, and form. Now all of this is considered a single fundamental, and anything that you draw can be simplified down to this. Next we have proportions, and this can be applied to everything since everything relies on it. Start by learning the face and body proportions and the placements first. Just this will take you pretty far. As I would put it, drawing fundamentals make the drawings look good, but proportions make the drawings look right. So next we have perspective. This can be applied to everything, even color. This is what gives drawing depth and also helps communicate form. Now the part furthest outside the table, and it's most important for learning all of this, is observation. This is required for learning everything. So the more you train your eye, the faster you can learn. You gotta train yourself to see like an artist. So for simplicity's sake, we're assuming that you're trying to learn to draw figures. As an example, so we'll start with the drawing fundamentals that takes you to about forms, where then you take basic forms and put them together to create complex forms. Now this will help you make structures look solid, but this will also make your drawings look rigid. So to balance it out, we add gesture. This will help give drawings flow and energy. But if you take this too far, you could lose the form of the drawing. So you're gonna have to balance form and gesture to get dynamic figures that look great. Now lastly, we have anatomy. So before this point, you should have already learned the proportions and placements of the anatomy that you want to draw. And the anatomy that you're learning at this point is merely details. Beginners tend to put too much emphasis on anatomy, when in reality what they really need to focus on is the proportions of the anatomy that you want to do. Because just getting the general shape of the body part that you want to draw is enough to convey it. But what's more important is the proportion and placement of it. But learning anatomy at this point will help your drawings look more informed. So finally, we're going to move into color. This includes hue, value, and saturation. There's way more to each of these, and this can go a lot more in depth, but we'll save that rabbit hole for next time. The important thing that you need to know is that color requires context, since color is relative. Now to sum it all up, we can apply design to all of the above, mostly to shape, proportions, and color. Then we use all of this to decide our composition, which is all used in service of your storytelling. Now, a common misconception on how people learn art is that they think it's like learning math in school, where it looks something more like a staircase, where you go through addition, subtraction, and then later go into multiplication and division, and so on. and you just keep going and you apply all those things that you've learned before, and you don't have to revisit them because you're constantly using them. They go through art the same way, where they touch a subject once and then they move on and they never go back to it. But that's not how art works. This works a lot better for knowledge-based subjects, but for something that's skill-based, it looks a little bit more like an RPG skill tree. There's a lot of branches and you can always add more stats to each skill. Now, the progression could be numbers like in Dark Souls or D&D, but I prefer progress bars because it helps you show you're progressing from one level to the next. This is merely a starting point and you can customize it to your liking based on how you want to learn art. And you can either make it more specific or more general. I've included a PDF in the link down below, so yeah, you can just download that completely free. Now, how does this work? Each fundamental affects another, and then it becomes a prerequisite to that fundamental. So when you level up a prerequisite skill, you'll get an XP buff that helps you level up the others much faster. So if you have a higher level in a prerequisite, that gives you a much bigger XP buff. So if progress is slow, it's most likely that you're missing an XP buff from a prerequisite fundamental. Now, each level in a skill represents either a concept or a technique that you need to learn. For example, in lines, the first level, you have to learn how to make continuous lines. So that's where you remove that bad habit of making scratchy lines and get used to having flowy, continuous lines. Now in the second level, you're going to start to make more precise and straight lines, something that's a bit more controlled because you want to start using these to make shapes. The third level, you'll learn to add line weight to help represent more form in your drawings, and so on. So how can you tell that you've leveled up in a skill? So an easy way to tell is that when you're learning a concept or a skill for that level, you no longer have to think about it and you're already using it. Like it's almost second nature. Now, in terms of leveling up, obviously it's better to just max out all of the stats. But that's not very efficient because you want to get to a build where you can use your skills professionally as soon as possible. So depending on a discipline that you're intending to go into, you want to start with a different initial build. So here's a chart from Psychra where you can see the different art disciplines and the different fundamentals that they prioritize. Now, before I recommend how to structure your practices based off this chart, I want to give you a few things that I do not recommend that you do in your practices. Number one, don't juggle. So in some RPG games, there's something called compound exercises or compound training, where you do a certain training that helps you skill up multiple skills at the same time. And this works, but in game it's also a little slower. But in reality, this just splits your focus and you end up not really learning much, if anything at all. Another thing you should avoid is practicing something that's too advanced for you. So this is like fighting a monster or a boss that's way too high level for you to handle, and it will cause too much effort for you to even beat it, that even if you do beat it, you can't grind a lot. So instead, try fighting a medium level monster that just engages you just enough that you don't require maximum effort, and then you can farm XP. In essence, don't bite more than you can chew. Otherwise, you'll just get wiped. Don't get XP, lose morale, and that's gonna lead to burnout. Now, I also want to address style and where it fits in all of this. So art style, like play style, is not an objective in the game. It is not a magic item you find. It is not a boss that you defeat. It is the choices that you make on how you build your character. It is the weapons of your choice. It is your combat style. It is how you play the game. So don't worry about finding style. It's merely a culmination of your knowledge, skills, and preferences. So just focus on playing the game. Now, finally, how do you practice? So for the sake of longevity and not burning out, I've also added sanity and stamina gauges. Now, this is not really practical in the sheet itself. It's less of a stat and more of a reminder. Now, everybody has different energy levels and they fluctuate differently. So you're gonna have to gauge your energy levels yourself. Now, the stamina gauge is pretty straightforward. It goes down as you do stuff and replenishes with rest, sleep, and general health stuff. So don't forget to light that bonfire and get some rest. Now for sanity, when you're practicing or grinding, your sanity goes down. So whenever you're focusing on one of these fundamentals, this is what brings your sanity down. So how do you replenish it? You replenish it by doing something that you enjoy or just have fun doing.
So what you're saying is, I just practice for a bit, then I can go play video games.
No, that's just dopamine farming. Instead, try drawing something that you like. Try to paint. Do the copying exercise from the previous video. Make an OC. Let out all the depraved thoughts that's been imprisoned in your mind and set it free. In other words, go enjoy making art. Doesn't mean you completely forget the practice and exercises you just did. Instead, incorporate them. Get used to using them. Don't practice smooth lines just to then go back to scratchy lines 5 minutes later. Because even though drawing your furry OC doesn't necessarily level up your fundamentals in a significant way, it adds to the most important gauge of all, mileage. Now this is how you really progress. You can't just grind in Dark Souls. You need to play the game. You can't just spend your entire life grinding, waiting until you're good enough. This is Dark Souls, not Mario Kart. The best player isn't who's the fastest, but who's played longest. You're a noob or casual player who's comparing yourself to speedrunners who have spent years mastering the game. Now it's time for you to master your game, but not at the expense of your love for the game. The worst thing that could happen in the endeavor of acquiring great skill is losing your love for the craft. So remember to play the game. What makes both art and Dark Souls so enjoyable isn't all the time you spend grinding. Yes, it's required to make progress easier, but you can't actually progress without playing the game. So hopefully this was an eye-opening experience and you learned something from this. Tell me if anything in the video resonated with you in the comments below. If you need help figuring out what your current stats are, you can always visit me on my Twitch channel when I'm live. Tweet me your art-related questions at Og's Art Support. And as always, take your time and enjoy the process.